Allahu Akbar.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Assalamu alaikum. Brothers and sisters, I have been asked to speak briefly on the topic of injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Now, this is a very popular expression. It has been popularized with the use of this expression by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It was an expression of a heartfelt conviction, a conviction that he had as he was a martyr for social justice, a conviction that he actually held dear to his heart, that if there is injustice anywhere on the planet, they don't have to be a member of my family, they don't have to be co-religionists, they don't have to be a part of my economic or academic class, I don't have to know them, but if there is injustice anywhere on this earth, then it presents a threat to justice everywhere. And so I want to use that expression by Dr. King as a starting off point for a brief discussion here today. Because too often, many of us believe, especially when we look at the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that the civil and human rights struggle in this country is all over. That because there's a statue of Dr. King on the monument in Washington, D.C. now, that it must be over because he's symbolizing the cessation of all injustice as it would relate to here in the United States. But I just want to remind myself and remind you that this is very, very far from the case. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we know the expressions, the hadith that we can read about how keenly he sensitized us to not allowing any kind of injustice to be within arm's reach or will be within the sounds of our voice or to enter into our hearts, that we know very clearly that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam made it clear that by no means should any of us be satisfied that our condition is fine if I have enough to eat at night, and if my neighbor is hungry, then I'm in error. We can go through so many phases of expression by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but let me just read you one very quickly to remind me and remind you that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was not just talking about what I owe to my Muslim brother and sister, and we owe a lot. But he was talking about every one of Allah's creation. In a hadith that's contained in the Sunan of Abu Dawood, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was reported to have said that, let it be known that if anyone commits injustice, insults, aggravates, mistreats, or abuses a person of the book, the Ahlul Kitab, the Christians and the Jews, that he will have to answer to me on the day of judgment. Brothers and sisters, let me just quote one other martyr for justice, a Muslim martyr in this country, and then I'll go quickly on with this talk. And that is a quotation from Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, Malcolm X. That you and I know that Malcolm was a martyr for this deen. He was a martyr for social justice in this country. And out of all of the expressions that he has made, let me just quote one of them. And he says that I'm for truth no matter who tells it. I am for justice no matter who it is for or who it is against. So don't get angry with me today if I say something that first I'm pointing at myself. I don't mean to make anyone feel uncomfortable, but I have to stand here and say that if we're talking about injustice anywhere as a threat to justice everywhere, let's start with ourselves. Let's start in our homes. If, in fact, the essence of justice is the knowledge and the conviction that we are accountable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for what we do, and that all of Allah's creatures are created equal, and what distinguishes us is what we do in pleasure to Allah with our souls and our behavior, and the opposite is true of what is injustice, is the lack of conviction about accountability. It's the belief that all people are not created equal, that some of us deserve privilege and exception just by the basis of being born, not based on what we've done, not based on how we present ourselves to others. And so I have to say that if I go home and I mistreat my wife because I'm giving this Imam maid in my house, and I go home and I abuse my wife and my children, how can I say that I believe that this Zoj of mine, that she is equal to me as a human being? I may have a different role, but it gives me no right to come into my house and to terrorize my wife and my children. So the kind of injustice that I may commit inside of my house is a threat to justice in your house, because how in the world can any of us be comfortable knowing that any of our women and our children are being abused by egomaniac men who think that we can do with our women and children whatever we want to do? It threatens my house when you do it, and it threatens your house when I do that. Brothers and sisters, we're in a country right now, we're sitting in a space right now that was occupied by Native American people. Throughout this hemisphere, there were millions of Native Americans, many with very advanced civilizations prior to the European colonial experience. And so this nation was built on the backs, literally, of this community from one coast to the next coast, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Millions of people, and where do you find them today? Half of them are on these things called reservations. We're talking about what used to be millions of people, and now you can't find a total population of Native Americans in this country that would equal 1.5 million. What happened to them? Where did they go? Part of their disappearance came, and Allah knows best, but it had to be factored in there somewhere where these people are nothing. They're standing in the way of progress. That our society, that our civilization is so much better, so just get them out of the way. So if it means putting smallpox in blankets and giving it to them and having them die from these kind of diseases, it makes no difference. Just get rid of them. Why? Because we feel that we are superior to these savages. So do whatever it takes to advance our project. Brothers and sisters, if we sit here today and ignore the plight of Native Americans, one of the greatest injustices in the world today, that just a relative handful of people crammed into these reservations. I think it's about 370 reservations across the country. Some of them large, some of them small, but some of the worst poverty on the face of the earth. Gripping poverty that you would think you were in the worst conditioned third world country on this earth. Just go to these reservations. Look at the alcoholism. Look at the unemployment rate. Look at the lack of life. That is an injustice. And if it's an injustice there, then it threatens justice right here in this hall. It threatens in our Islamic centers, in our masajid. Brothers and sisters, how can you and I sit in a country that incarcerates more than any of its citizens, more than any place on the face of the earth? I'm talking about right here in the good old US of A. Almost 2.5 million of its citizens are incarcerated as we sit here. Many of them that we know are in these boxes. At least 155 Muslims' pictures were in the wall. That in some of the sessions we were looking at these pictures, these Muslims who've been trapped in a war on terrorism. And as that war plays out, more and more Muslims are trapped behind these walls every day. But it is an American Holocaust. It is unfathomable, it's unconscionable for you and I to be comfortable with so many American citizens locked in these cages like animals, treated worse than people would treat their dogs or their cats, denied every vestige of humanity. That 12% of the population, and I'm talking about African Americans, would constitute over 60% of the population in these prisons. If I sit back and say, well, they're in these prisons because black people have this predisposition to crime, there are more criminals who are African Americans. And so I don't have to say anything about it. I don't have to take a stand. Why? Because I think they're less than I am. But as Dr. King and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ would remind us, if that is an injustice, if this is an American Holocaust, I submit that if it were from any other race or ethnicity in this country, there would be a declaration of a moratorium on locking people up. The National Guard should be going through the streets, monitoring the police and the courts, if it were anyone other than the population that we have in these courts, in these jails today. When we look around the world and we see the evidence that's staring us in the face of child labor and the abuse of labor all around the world, where our little children are being chained sometimes in factories, working 7 days a week. Why? Why don't we care about it? Because I like Nikes, right? I like my Nikes, so don't bore me with details of how these shoes are made. Don't bore me with the labor in South America. Don't bore me about how this fresh fruit comes on my table. Don't bore me about the price of all that I have and how cheap it is relative to other non-oil producing places around the world. Don't bore me with that. Let me enjoy my status. Why? Because I feel somehow that I deserve all of this. So don't bore me with the details. Let me enjoy what I have. Brothers and sisters, Dr. King, in his last organized campaign, that he didn't organize it, but he supported the sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. And Dr. King was assassinated standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis. And he was there on behalf of the sanitation workers. Dr. King spoke out for the workers. Dr. King spoke out against war when he knew that it was unpopular and would have consequences. On April the 4th, 1967, in the Riverside Baptist Church in Harlem, Dr. King spoke out against the Vietnam War. 1 year to the date, and I'm not trying to do the math on this, but 1 year to the date when he spoke out against the Vietnam War, he was assassinated on April the 4th, 1968. Brothers and sisters, whether we're talking about banksters who have conducted the greatest fraud on the American people and especially poor people with these subprime lending, and we find that none of them go to jail. But if a mother steals a loaf of bread out of the Safeway supermarket, she will possibly go to jail. Brother Saeed, let me just read this one final quote, and I'm done. And I want to close because we started with this quotation from Dr. King, and I want to end with one by him. And that is that change does not roll on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle. And so we must straighten our backs and work for our freedom. A man can't ride you unless your back is bent. Assalamu alaikum.